The Battle of Okinawa was one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. It involved American and Japanese forces who fought over a small island just off the coast of mainland Japan. You're probably asking yourself why they were fighting over an island that wasn't very valuable strategically when it could be reached by mainland Japan in a few hours by boat or plane. That is a great question, and we'll get to the answer in this episode. I'm the host, and this is a World War II special episode about the Battle of Okinawa. Let's jump into it. In April 1945, the United States had successfully taken control of most of the Pacific Islands. But it still needed to capture some more in order to get close enough to mainland Japan to launch its attack there. American leaders believed that the next step after the island of Iwo Jima would be the island of Okinawa. It was only 340 miles away from the Japanese mainland. Taking it would bring them even closer to Japan, and it would allow them to bombard Japan with their aircraft. Also, there were a lot of Japanese troops stationed on the island because they believed it would be the next target of the Allies. So if the Americans wanted to take the island, they knew they'd have to fight hard. American General MacArthur wanted to take the island by April, which was only a month away. This meant that the troops would have to move fast. On April 1, 1945, American ships started firing upon the island of Okinawa, kicking off the battle. Around 80,000 Japanese soldiers defended the island, while the Allies had around 50,000 troops on their ships surrounding the island. They knew that they would need naval support to win this battle. So the Allies sent in hundreds of ships, including 650 combat ships and 200 cargo ships. The Japanese Navy was no match for the Allies, and it quickly retreated. This made the Allies think that the battle would be easy, but they were wrong. While the Japanese Navy was no match for the Allies, the Japanese Army was. The Japanese Army dug a vast network of tunnels and caves on the island where they hid their weapons, supplies and troops. These underground fortifications were so extensive that the Japanese could move around the entire island through them without ever coming to the surface. The Japanese also used these tunnels to launch surprise attacks on the Allies. These attacks often involved groups of kamikaze pilots. Kamikaze pilots were Japanese suicide bombers who crashed their planes into their targets and killed themselves in the process. The kamikaze pilots were willing to sacrifice themselves because they believed that it was their duty to defend their country from the evil Western powers. Over 3,800 kamikaze attacks were conducted during the Battle of Okinawa. While the kamikaze pilots were successful at inflicting damage on the Allies, they did not turn the tide of the battle in favor of the Japanese. As weeks went by, the Allies became more and more frustrated with the Japanese resistance. In an attempt to break through the Japanese lines, the Allies conducted something called Operation Iceberg. Operation Iceberg involved landing thousands of troops on the beaches of Okinawa and then having the Navy bombard the Japanese positions on the beaches. What the Allies didn't know was that the Japanese had set up a large number of mines near the shore. As soon as the Allied troops hit the beaches, the mines exploded and many of them were killed. Those that survived were picked off by Japanese snipers hidden in the caves. Seeing how difficult it was to land on the beaches, the Allies abandoned that plan and instead focused on trying to outlast the Japanese. As the Allies and Japanese continued to fight, the people of Okinawa suffered greatly. Many of them were caught in the crossfire and were killed. Others were forced to flee their homes and become refugees. Still others were taken hostage by the Japanese army. The Japanese believed that if the Allies captured the island, they would either kill the hostages or force them to work as slaves. One of the most infamous hostage situations occurred in the village of Konishi. There, the Japanese army rounded up around 100 civilians and held them hostage in the village school. Every day, the Japanese army forced the hostages to dig tunnels and build fortifications. They also beat and tortured the hostages, both physically and mentally. Eventually, the Allies captured the island, but not before the Japanese army had killed or tortured to death all but 12 of the hostages. The civilian deaths and atrocities committed by both sides led to the battle being known as the Pacific's most humane battle. By May, the Allies were starting to get worried. They had been fighting on the island for over a month and had made little progress against the Japanese. They also knew that the Japanese were planning a counterattack. In order to avoid being trapped on the beaches during the Japanese counterattack, the Allies retreated back to their ships. From there, they launched a massive air assault on the island. Thousands of aircraft were involved in the air assault, dropping bombs and firing upon Japanese positions. The air assault lasted for days and inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese. However, it did not break their will to fight. On June, the Allies made one last push to capture the island. This time, they landed on the beaches without any naval support. The Japanese were expecting this and had set up strong defenses. Once again, the Allies suffered heavy casualties, but they were able to push forward. Slowly but surely, the Allies began to gain ground. By July, they had captured most of the island. But the fighting continued until September. The Japanese continued to put up fierce resistance, but they were eventually forced to surrender. The Allies had won the battle, but at a great cost. Around 260,000 Japanese soldiers and 75,000 Okinawans had been killed. The Allies had lost around 50,000 troops. So, why did the Allies fight so hard to capture Okinawa? We talked about the strategic value of the island earlier in the video, but there was another reason. The Allies wanted to show the Japanese people the true cost of war. By capturing Okinawa, they hoped to force the Japanese to surrender. They also hoped that the Japanese people would force their leaders to end the war. Sadly, neither of these things happened. The Japanese continued to fight until the United States dropped two atomic bombs on Japan. When the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese people were horrified. They had never seen anything like this before. The bombs killed around 200,000 people and destroyed much of the Japanese industrial capacity. After seeing what had happened, the Japanese finally agreed to surrender. After the battle, the people of Okinawa were in a bad way. Their homes and businesses had been destroyed and many of them had lost family members. However, they were determined to rebuild their lives. With the help of the United States, they rebuilt their homes and businesses, and the island of Okinawa became a popular tourist destination. Today, the Battle of Okinawa is remembered as one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. It was a battle between two powerful nations who were fighting for their very survival. The battle was fought with great ferocity and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. However, the battle was also a turning point in the war. It showed the Japanese people the true cost of war and helped to bring about their surrender. So what can we learn from the Battle of Okinawa? I believe that we can learn several lessons from this battle. First, we can learn about the importance of strategy. The Battle of Okinawa was a costly one for both sides. However, I believe that it was a necessary battle. The Allies needed to capture the island in order to get close enough to mainland Japan to launch their attack there. Secondly, we can learn about the importance of endurance. The Battle of Okinawa was a long and hard-fought battle. However, the Allies were able to win the battle because they were able to endure the hardships of fighting on the island. Finally, I believe that we can learn about the importance of forgiveness. The Battle of Okinawa was a brutal one. However, I believe that it is important to forgive those who have wronged us. The people of Okinawa forgave the Japanese army for the atrocities they committed on the island. So what do you think? What lessons can we learn from the Battle of Okinawa? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching. In our last video we looked at what Japan's strategic goal was with their invasion of this tiny island of Okinawa. And in it I hinted that the reason why Japan chose to invade Okinawa was because that's where the U.S. was planning to invade Japan from. But now it is time to flip the script and look at what the strategic goal of the U.S. was for capturing Okinawa. So let's do it. Now if you remember from the last video, Japan thought that if they could successfully invade and capture Okinawa, then they would be able to threaten the U.S. mainland by launching attacks from there. You can imagine then that the U.S. wanted to capture Okinawa to remove that threat from the Japanese. But that's not the whole story. The first thing we need to look at is China. Because during the war the Chinese were fighting against the Japanese. And while the Chinese weren't formally allied with the U.S., they were receiving lots of aid from the U.S. So for the U.S., it was in their best interest to help the Chinese win the war. And China was winning the war against Japan. At least at the beginning of 1945, the Chinese were pushing the Japanese back. They were marching on the city of Rangoon, which was a very important supply base for the Japanese. And if they took Rangoon, then the Japanese would have serious issues supplying their troops in the region. So helping the Chinese take Rangoon was a top priority for the U.S. But there was a problem. The Chinese couldn't get to Rangoon without taking the island of Hainan, which was controlled by the Japanese. Now there are two ways the Chinese could have attacked and taken Hanoi. They could have gone directly across the water, but the problem with this approach is that the Chinese weren't really a naval power. They had a navy, but it wasn't comparable to the Japanese or the U.S. Navy. So a seaborne assault on Hino was risky and it would have been a tough fight. The other option for the Chinese was to seize the island of Okinawa and then use that as a jumping-off point to attack Hino. Now since the Chinese already had a large force assembled on Okinawa, this seemed like the best option. The Chinese commander-in-chief, Chiang Kai-shek, wanted approval to launch his Hainan campaign on March 1, 1945. But before he could do so, the Chinese got word that the Americans planned to invade Japan from Okinawa. And this created a big dilemma for the Chinese. Should they invade Hainan now and risk competing with the Americans for control of the island? Or should they wait for the Americans to take Okinawa and then just push over the last few miles of water and take Hainan themselves? Ultimately, Chiang decided to wait. He pushed back the Hainan campaign to April. And as we saw in the last video, by that time Japan had lost interest in defending Okinawa. Alright. Now let's talk about the real reason why the U.S. wanted to capture Okinawa. On May, American General MacArthur issued a statement outlining his plans for the final defeat of Japan. In it he stated that Japan would be attacked from three sides. The first attack would come from the north and it would be led by the Soviet Union. We talked about this briefly in our last video. Basically, the Soviets would declare war on Japan, send a large force of troops into Manchuria and force the Japanese to evacuate northeast China and retreat south. Meanwhile, the Chinese would take Hainan and then drive west across the South China Sea to Canton and then march on the Chinese capital of Nanjing. To the east, American forces in the Philippines would attack Formosa and the Japanese naval base at Truk. American forces in India would also attack into Burma and drive towards Bangkok. Finally, there was the Western Pacific Invasion Force, which would invade Japan proper most likely through the island of Kyushu. So as you can see, Okinawa was an extremely important part of this plan. It was going to serve as the staging ground for the invasion of Japan. Now the plan was for the U.S. Navy to bombard the shores of Okinawa with massive firepower, destroying any and all Japanese defensive works. Then the Marines would hit the beaches and secure them. And finally, once everything was secure, the bulk of the American army would land and begin their march on Shuri, which was the main city on the island. That was the plan anyway. But as we saw in our last video, things didn't go quite as planned. One of the biggest problems facing the U.S. when planning this invasion was logistics. Remember, this was before the advent of modern cargo planes, helicopters, and other technology that we have today. And so the vast majority of supplies and equipment for the U.S. military had to be shipped over long distances on these big old cargo ships. But the Pacific Ocean is a big place and there aren't that many ports along the way. And so finding enough places to stop and resupply and refuel was a bit of a challenge. This map shows every port that the U.S. used to stage supplies for the invasion. You can see there aren't that many dots on the map. There are more toward the end of the war as the U.S. captured more islands, but early on, the U.S. really only had a few options. So they needed to make sure that the islands they captured were worth the effort. So after the liberation of the Philippines in early 1945, the US began looking around for the perfect island to use as their base of operations. At first they considered Formosa, but it was too close to Japan. And so if they were going to attack Japan, there was a good chance that the Japanese could reinforce the island and block its use. They also considered the island of Hainan, but that was too far south. If they were going to supply their troops fighting in China, they needed a staging ground closer to the coast of China. So eventually they settled on Okinawa. It was far enough away from Japan to avoid being counterattacked. It was close enough to China to supply their troops there. And finally, and probably most importantly, Okinawa was nowhere near any major shipping lanes. And so the US could safely bring their large transports loaded with men and material close to shore and still not worry about enemy submarines attacking them. As the battle for Okinawa was coming to a close, the US began planning the invasion of Japan. And once again, Okinawa proved to be very useful because the island was practically empty of Japanese soldiers by this point. The US was able to use the Japanese infrastructure to begin staging their invasion. As we saw in our last video, the Japanese built a lot of infrastructure on the island. They built barracks to house their troops, roads to transport their troops and supplies, and docks to unload their supplies. All of this was quickly converted to use by the Americans. The barracks were used to house Marines and Navy sailors. The roads were repaired and used to move supplies from the beaches to staging areas. And the docks were repaired and used to unload supplies. However, one thing the Americans didn't have to deal with much was friendly fire. While the Japanese had constructed a lot of infrastructure on the island, they hadn't completed a lot of it. Some of the rail lines on the island had been completed, but none of the major highways had been finished. So the engineers of the 7th Army, who landed on Okinawa, found themselves spending more time clearing roadblocks and repairing damaged roads than actually fighting the Japanese. And finally, one last bonus reason why the US wanted to capture Okinawa is because the island itself was a treasure trove of supplies. The Japanese had brought a lot of material to the island, expecting to be able to defend it. And once they realized they couldn't, they left behind thousands of trucks, rifles, artillery pieces, and even airplanes. This windfall of war gave the US a huge boost in supplies, allowing them to better equip their troops and giving them enough vehicles to begin training people to operate them. So those are the reasons why the US wanted to capture Okinawa. What do you think? Are there any other reasons why the US wanted to invade Okinawa? Let me know in the comments below. Also, a big thank you to our supporters. I hope you're enjoying this series. If you want to support the channel and appear in these credits, then check the links below. Thank you all very much. The Battle of Okinawa is one of the most underrated battles in all of human history. With over 70,000 casualties between the Japanese and the Allies, it was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific during World War II, and many believe that it was the bloodiest battle of the war. Even though it isn't talked about as much as other major battles like Iwo Jima or Midway, it still had some insane moments. Like when over 380 Japanese planes attacked Allied forces in a single day. In this episode, we're gonna now look at how the Kamikaze attacks impacted the course of the naval Battle of Okinawa. The first Kamikaze attack against the U.S. Navy took place in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Since then, they have become a nightmare for American sailors. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, over 3,000 Japanese planes attacked the U.S. Navy in what is known as the Battle of Surigao Strait. Out of those planes, 700 were suicide bombers. Those 700 planes sank or damaged 26 U.S. ships, including 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. By the time the battle was over, the U.S. had suffered its worst one-day loss of ships since Pearl Harbor. As the war progressed and Japan became more desperate, kamikaze attacks only grew in frequency and ferocity. So by the time April 1945 rolled around and the United States landed troops on the island of Okinawa, the U.S. Navy was well aware of what was coming. Before we dive into the Battle of Okinawa, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new episodes. Now back to Okinawa. The island of Okinawa lies about 350 miles south of mainland Japan and 325 miles east of China. In early 1945, Japanese High Command realized that an invasion from the west was imminent. And even though they knew that invading forces would likely land around Naha, near the southern tip of the island, they had no idea where exactly it would happen. In preparation for the inevitable, the Japanese built an elaborate network of underground tunnels and pillboxes all over the island. They also stationed approximately 100,000 soldiers there, including 3 elite divisions, 3 independent mixed brigades and several auxiliary units. This force was commanded by Lieutenant General Isamu Cho. But despite all the preparations, when the U.S. landed on April, they landed 80 miles north of Naha. This meant that most of the prepared defenses were never used. But even so, the Americans were in for a world of hurt. Over the next 3 months, the U.S. would suffer almost 50,000 casualties, killed, wounded or missing. On April, 6 escort carriers, 9 destroyers and 38 landing ships began launching attacks on the island. These ships provided fire support for the thousands of Marines who landed on the beaches that same day. As the Marines advanced inland, they found that the Japanese were ready for them. Machine guns raked the beaches, mowing down anyone who got too close. Explosives planted in the beaches detonated, sending shrapnel and dirt flying through the air. Mortar and artillery fire rained down on the invaders. All along the 35-mile front line, fierce fighting took place as the Marines struggled to gain a foothold. Over the next few days, reinforcements arrived, helping the Marines push inland a few hundred yards. But progress was slow and costly. On April, the Marines received word that a relief force consisting of Army troops would arrive within 2 weeks. So they dug in, hoping that the Army would be able to push the Japanese back and secure the island. The Navy was also doing their part, pounding the Japanese with everything they had. From their positions offshore, they launched attack after attack, destroying anything that moved on the shore. But the Japanese kept bringing up reinforcements and supplies via submarine. Also, whenever a ship came within range, kamikaze pilots would crash their planes into it. On April, just a few days after the initial landings, 65 kamikaze planes attacked the American fleet. 32 were shot down, but not before damaging 5 American vessels. 2 days later, 10 more planes attacked, although none made it through the American screen. But things were about to get much worse. On May, the Japanese launched a massive air attack against the Americans. It was the largest attack in the Pacific since the Battle of Midway. Over 380 planes participated in the assault on Okinawa. Most of the planes were from the 201st Air Group, which flew Mitsubishi 6M0s and were led by Vice Admiral Minoru Genda. Genda's task force split into 3 groups, each with its own mission. The first group of 150 planes, led by Rear Admiral Ikuma Kono, attacked the transports and landing craft off the coast of Okinawa. The second group, led by Rear Admiral Chumai Honda, attacked the battleships and cruisers of the U.S. Navy. And the third group, under the command of Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Imamura, attacked airfields and supply bases. The Americans were completely caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack. They didn't know that the Japanese could put together such a large force. The kamikazes hit the transports and landing ships hard, sinking 14 and damaging dozens more. Then they turned their attention to the battleships and cruisers. But the kamikazes were in for a surprise. The ships of the U.S. Navy had been fitted with new armor designed to protect them from air attacks. Also, the anti-aircraft gunners on board the ships had been practicing for months, anticipating the kamikaze attacks. Although the kamikazes managed to sink 2 destroyers and damage 4 other ships, the rest were driven off. But the Japanese weren't done yet. On May, they launched another massive air attack, this time with over 500 planes. Once again, the Americans were caught off guard, but this time they were more prepared. The new armor and anti-aircraft guns held up against the Kamikaze bombers, and only 3 American ships were damaged. But even though the Kamikaze attacks were devastating, they couldn't change the outcome of the battle. On June, the army finally arrived and pushed the Japanese back, securing the island. By the end of the battle on June, the Japanese had lost over 190,000 men, while the Allies had suffered almost 50,000 casualties. But even though the Allies had won, the Kamikaze attacks had taken a heavy toll on their forces. Of the 147 ships sunk or damaged during the battle, 43 were sunk by kamikaze attacks. And of the 50,000 casualties suffered by the Allies, nearly 2,000 were the result of these attacks. The kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Okinawa were some of the most intense of the war. In a single day, over 500 Japanese planes attacked the American fleet. And even though the Americans were able to shoot down most of them, the kamikazes still managed to sink or damage almost 150 ships. But even though the kamikaze attacks were devastating, they couldn't change the outcome of the battle. The Allies were able to hold off the Japanese long enough for reinforcements to arrive, and they eventually won the battle. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other videos on the Battle of Okinawa. We have a playlist of the entire series. If you want to learn more about the Pacific, make sure to check out our podcasts. Thanks for watching. Did you know that Japan planned to sacrifice over 2 million civilians during their final stand in Okinawa? Why were the Japanese so willing to do this? What made them think it would work? And why is this one of history's most evil plans? Let's find out. Japan had been fighting a desperate losing battle for quite some time. The war with the Allies was not going well at all. And Japan knew that they were in trouble. But even when defeat seemed inevitable, they refused to surrender. They wanted to fight until the very end. And by the end, they didn't just mean military personnel. They meant innocent civilians, too. In April 1945, American forces landed in Okinawa, an island south of Japan proper. Japan desperately needed a victory. They needed to show their people that they could still win the war. And so they chose to make a final stand in Okinawa. They thought that the terrain of the island would help them. It was surrounded by water on 3 sides, which made it easy to defend. On the other side, there was a forest which also helped them hide from the Allies. But Japan's biggest advantage was the large number of civilians on the island. There were more than 100,000 people living in Okinawa, mostly farmers and fishermen. The Japanese army began recruiting these civilians into their army. They told them that they needed help defending the island from the Americans. In reality, they had much more sinister plans for them. The Japanese army organized the civilians into fighting units. They gave them weapons and ammunition and trained them how to use them. But they never intended for these civilians to actually fight the Americans. Instead, they were going to be used as human shields. The Japanese army stationed them in homes, schools, and hospitals. They told the locals that this would protect them from the Americans. But really, they were just being used as bait. The Japanese army knew that the Americans would not want to kill innocent civilians. So they forced the locals to stay in areas where they knew the Americans would be fighting. This way, they hoped to protect themselves while also causing heavy casualties on the American side. But it wasn't just the locals who were being used as human shields. As the Battle of Okinawa raged on, the Japanese army began bringing in more and more civilians from other parts of Japan. They packed them into trains and sent them to Okinawa. Many of these civilians were women and children. The Japanese army didn't care. They were just numbers in their plan. When the Americans finally captured Okinawa, they found out just how evil the Japanese army was. They found mass graves filled with the bodies of civilians. They also found reports that the Japanese army had been forcing locals to eat poisonous mushrooms before the Americans arrived. This was so that the civilians would not fall into enemy hands alive. The Japanese army had planned to sacrifice over 2 million civilians in Okinawa. But why? Why were they willing to do such a horrible thing? One reason was that the Japanese army was desperate. They knew that they were losing the war and they needed a victory. They thought that by sacrificing civilians in Okinawa, they could inflict heavy casualties on the Americans and maybe even force them to surrender. Another reason was that the Japanese army was fanatical. They believed that Japan was invincible, and that their emperor was a god. They didn't care how many civilians they had to sacrifice to win the war. A third reason was that the Japanese army was racist. They believed that Japanese soldiers were superior to other races, and that it was their duty to conquer the world. They saw the civilians in Okinawa as nothing more than pawns in their game. But what if the Japanese army had succeeded? What if they had inflicted heavy casualties on the Americans in Okinawa? Do you think America would have surrendered? No. America would have just kept fighting. And what's worse, they would have done the same thing to Japanese civilians. In World War II, both sides were willing to do horrible things to each other's civilians. It was not uncommon for soldiers to rape and pillage enemy villages. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire of war and many of them died. Both sides committed atrocities against each other's civilians. So if the Japanese army had succeeded in Okinawa, the Americans would have done the same thing back. What do you think would have happened to Japanese civilians if the Japanese army had won the Battle of Okinawa? Let me know in the comments. But let's go back to the present. As soon as the Americans captured Okinawa, they began helping the survivors. They set up medical camps to treat the wounded, and they distributed food and supplies to those who had lost everything. The Americans also set up schools for the children of Okinawa so that they could continue their education. The Japanese army may have failed in Okinawa, but their evil plan will never be forgotten. Here are some additional points to consider. The Japanese army's plan to sacrifice civilians in Okinawa was one of the most evil plans in history. It was only stopped because the Japanese army was defeated. If they had not been defeated, they may have continued their atrocities against civilians. The Japanese army showed no mercy to the civilians they were using as human shields. They did not care if they were killed or injured. The Japanese army was willing to sacrifice anyone to win the war. The Battle of Okinawa was one of the most brutal battles of World War II. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the fighting. After the battle ended, the Americans found mass graves filled with bodies. Some of the civilians had been forced to eat poisonous mushrooms before the Japanese army retreated. This was so that they would not fall into enemy hands alive. It is important to remember the victims of the Japanese army's plan to sacrifice civilians in Okinawa. These people were innocent victims of a senseless war. They were killed or injured simply because the Japanese army wanted to win a battle. I want to ask you again, what do you think would have happened to Japanese civilians if the Japanese army had won the Battle of Okinawa? Let me know in the comments. After the war, many of the survivors of the Japanese army's plan to sacrifice civilians in Okinawa struggled to rebuild their lives. They had lost everything, their homes, their families and their friends. But they were able to rebuild their lives with the help of the Americans and the rest of the world. The Japanese army's plan to sacrifice civilians in Okinawa was one of the most evil plans in history. It was only stopped because the Japanese army was defeated. If they had not been defeated, they may have continued their atrocities against civilians. Now, here's another interesting topic for you. Did you know that after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's Emperor Hirohito wanted to sacrifice 20 million Japanese civilians in a final-ditch effort to force the Allies into accepting his nation's terms for ending the war? Click on this video to learn more about this insane plan, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more.